Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Tuesday, May the 26th. Parliament is in recess and despite all the action, British politics seems to have taken a bit of a pause over the bank holiday weekend for the record temperatures. And we're going to look into what lies beyond this recess as Westminster readies itself for two very consequential months in British politics. I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. The rest of the world absolutely isn't waiting for us to get our affairs in order, shall we say. President Trump authorised fresh bombing raids in Iran overnight. We'll do a little bit on this, Anne, but I just want to read you the headline of the Bloomberg lead on this story. It's up on their site at the moment. US strikes target in Iran as Trump hails progress on peace deal. I think that just about sums up the modern era of news. We're back to the idea of bombs for peace, but all in one headline.
After days of Donald Trump talking up a peace agreement, the US and Israeli jets struck Iranian vessels in the Strait of Hormuz and other targets. US Central Command said the strikes were targeting missile launch sites and boats, trying to place mines, and stressed they were defensive in nature and intended to protect troops from threats posed by Iranian forces.
My sense, Anne, is that the Foreign Office absolutely knew that fresh strikes were on the way as recently, or as far back really, as the middle of last week. So what happened overnight wasn't a surprise to our government. But whether or not this really takes us closer to peace, I don't know. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was telling reporters during a trip to India that talks on Iran could still take several days, adding that Trump could either agree a good deal or no deal at all.
And all of this is a powerful reminder that whether it's Andy Burnham or Keir Starmer or anyone else who ends up in number 10, the essential global challenges and the backwash for the UK economy remain the same.
Yeah, so we thought we'd use this post-bank holiday one-off recess edition to take the slightly longer view on the challenges that we face. And luckily for that, we're able to do that with particular vigour because you ended up working for quite a lot of the last few days over in Prague. Listeners might remember that's where Anne was last Thursday at what's known as the Global National Security Conference. And you were there all weekend alongside one very well-known voice to this podcast, outlining the challenges that everyone faces.
Yes, this is the GlobSec conference, so-called, held in Prague this year, Sam. It's really a big meeting of a lot of defence security, quite a lot of military top brass as well, lots of stripes on shoulders. And it does face, I think, more towards Eastern Central Europe, to the Balkans, to the Baltics, and into the Ukraine crisis than some other gatherings. And that's intriguing because one prominent British figure there was Morgan McSweeney, the elusive Mr. McSweeney. I had taken to calling him McCavity, like the mysterious cat in T.S. Eliot on the podcast. Well, in fairness to McSweeney, he really was out in public at this conference on a big panel, which we're going to sort of dive into because we thought we would kick off this morning by listening to the warning that he had to British politicians about the international situation and how it feeds into the changes in technology, in fake news, and in other things that he thought we ought to be worried about, apart from the fate of Keir Starmer.
People think that the danger with misinformation is that citizens believe lies. I think, and I've become increasingly of the view, that the greater danger is that people become exhausted, that people become so overwhelmed by anger, division, and manipulation that they don't just believe in anything at all. I was Chief of Staff in the UK government from 2024 to 2026. It was the first Labour government in 14 years. It was very clear to me that the new Labour government that we've got now is governing in a very different era to the previous Labour government. So for politicians, the challenge is how do you govern in an era of permanent disruption, not how you just react to it. It is an era that I think politically is being shaped by the insecurity of voters. And in that context, I think AI is not just an information channel. it is a new system of politics?
I think this is a really good moment to dive into some of the things that he was talking about. It's really interesting to hear him range much more widely than we did in his one other appearance in public, that select committee a few weeks ago in front of Emily Thornberry and her team, just about, well, really what he's doing is talking about what it's like when, for life in number 10 in that extract. He talks about people being exhausted, not believing in anything, the permanent disruption era shaped by voter insecurity. His remarks felt, if anything, a little bit like a cry of pain from his own time in number 10. And I can hear lots of sort of opponents, not least those inside the Labour Party, going, yes, you talk about, voter disengagement and voter disillusionment, up to a point, Lord Copper, you can't blame other people on that entirely, given that Keir Starmer came in with a landslide majority, but now seems to have all but squandered it. But I do think that he makes a decent point about permanent disruption coming from overseas. I don't know whether you've picked up this, Anne, but there is a sort of a vein in Labour thinking, maybe slightly self-pitying, maybe there's a point to it, I'm interested in what you think, that says that actually Keir Starmer would be pretty much in quite a strong position right now if it hadn't been for Donald Trump and in particular what he's been doing in Iran, but generally with how he's conducted foreign affairs. You've got good data recently, just a small uptick in GDP, a massive drop in net migration. You've got possibly positive data on waiting lists. But the thing that's really causing a problem in the British state right now is the knock-on effects on inflation from all of the stuff that Donald Trump's been doing. And wouldn't Keir be in a much better position if it wasn't for external factors? And I just thought that maybe the idea of permanent disruption from Morgan McSweeney was a tilt to that, and that's obviously something that won't go away if there's a change of prime minister here. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think just on the big picture that Morgan McSweeney was talking about, this idea that disruption and insecurity of voters, that's the spine of a kind of big problem for government communications machines in the UK, but also in the democracies as a whole, that is making governing a whole lot harder, and that the Iran crisis really does play into that. And I certainly left this conference of people who that they are not professional panickers, put it that way, but the defense security establishment, I think, much more worried in a way about the immediate aftermath of Iran than they are about the trajectory of the war in Ukraine in terms of really affecting voters and driving difficult choices there for those in power and for electorates. On your very good point that I think you have put your finger on something, I was also around some other people who've been in both in the Keir administration and previous ones in Labour at the weekend. And I think they do have a tendency to sort of blame Donald Trump for the problems that Keir Starmer is having. But 2 points on that. Well, those are the waters you swim in politics. You don't get to choose who is the president of the United States. And when we look at the conditions in which Donald Trump came to power and the fact that Kamala Harris's campaign for the left and the centre left hadn't really worked at all, it would appear that the problem goes a bit deeper than just wishing that Donald Trump wasn't there. But I think you're right. I think there is an element of that. The difficulty there is that argument that Keir Starmer had a very good week last week. He was certainly, I thought, just much more relaxed and had lost a lot of the stiffness that people were criticising him for. Some of the other data points you mentioned were good for him. But you come back to the fact that would Keir Starmer have these problems if he weren't Keir Starmer? If he had been able to leverage his leadership better and leverage the fact that he did come in guided very much by Morgan McSweeney in the election campaign and beyond, if he'd sort of done better in the job of Prime Minister, well, maybe that is the more fundamental issue than who is in the White House.
Nobody will ever definitively be able to answer that question, which makes it a great podcast question. Now, you were sitting in the audience while Morgan McSweeney was talking, and that means, I think by my calculation, you've become the first journalist to be able to put a question to him. And it's about the sort of core topic of this conference, which was security, particularly in relation to AI. Let's just listen to your exchange.
So I'm just interested if there's anything you've learned from practice that makes you think, I would conduct this a bit differently, knowing what you all know from media and politics.
So I think AI is different. The risk then for democracies is that election campaigns become much less of a national story and much closer to individual stories. And that becomes harder. So there's a question then for political parties and for the media about how to also act in a national interest. I think it's important for political parties and for democracies to be able to master the tools and not just try to police them. It is not unusual in the UK and the US, especially for the left, to begin in a Luddite position and to allow the right to dominate the mastery of a new tool. I think that's a danger with AI, because it's not just about the left and the right. It is about Democrats against authoritarians. And in that, I think the UK and other countries can learn a lot from how Ukraine is dealing with this moment.
Yeah, not just by your calculation. Actually, Morgan McSweeney confirmed to me that it was the first on-the-record answer he'd ever given to a journalist in a very long career. So I take that home as my medal from Prague. The point that he was making, and you heard it in the clip there clearly, is that he feels that the way that election campaigns are going to be conducted in the era of AI is going to be massively different from the kind of technically adept campaigns that he and others have been running in the last few years to get their parties elected, whether they were on the centre-left or the centre-right of politics. And he did make this very interesting point, which is certainly stuck in my mind, Sam, about the idea that AI just segments the voting population very differently to traditional campaigns, even as he says the ones that he was being told were so up to date when we thought about WhatsApp being the biggest change on the block. Well, he's saying that was interesting. It's a tool and many digital tools, but AI, he suggested, fundamentally different. It targets individual groups and their stories, and it can multiply that because it has no operational constraint. He said, well, you might have maybe chosen the 10 groups you wanted to address. Now you could maybe decide it's up to 5,000 or so. And where does that leave the idea that you're trying to campaign on the national interest and define it against your opponents who are also having their picture? But I think he was worried that the whole idea of national interest would go down the middle. Now, let's see if that's what in fact turns out to be the case. But the idea that AI was really coming absolutely for our elections and our election campaigning as a moment of massive upheaval, that did stick in my mind.
I do wonder whether or not this is going to be true so much of the next general election in 2028, 2029, when it's not clear to me that AI will be quite as advanced. But I mean, you know, if you're looking at a 10, 20-year timescale, it looks like it'll have a big impact in a way that you absolutely cannot predict. And I suppose the big bet that he's making, which doesn't seem a bad bet, is that effectively AI sort of swallows us up and becomes our main way and our main route into understanding the world. But again, you don't know that yet. But it does feel like the sort of tide is coming in, and we don't know how much it's going to envelop us. At its core, there was a really interesting distinction that I hadn't heard before, which is there'll be a national story, and then AI will tailor everything for individuals. And so the sort of media will trot off and cover a sort of national agenda that everyone sort of decides at an elite level, but that won't really play a big role in determining people's views. I mean, we've had a go at that being the way of doing politics ever since back to the Brexit referendum with Dominic Cummings and his segmentation. But he just thinks that AI will take that to a new level, and the segmentation will be much, much more refined and virtually tailored to the individual. Again, let's see how that works. Clearly, what he is saying is that there's a massive prize for who can master the electioneering AI tools. And given that we don't even know what they look like or who might shape them at the moment, this is essentially an emerging new fascinating field of political science and political practice that we don't even know who the pioneers are yet. Certainly the elections that we're having at the moment, whether you're looking at Makerfield, well, there's a national election vibe to that, and quite whether or not there's a great deal of segmentation, I don't know. But one thing I do recall, 6 weeks ago, listeners might remember, I did an interview with Vijay Rangarajan, the chief executive of the Electoral Commission, and he's really interested on this. He says the countries to look out for who are sort of in some senses pioneers of where democracy is going to go next are places like Israel and Ukraine, sort of frontier countries in challenging circumstances, and it's places like that where there's just fundamentally a lot less regulation, where you can see the sort of the new forms of electioneering battling it out. So whenever we get to that Ukrainian election, there'll be and we know that Morgan McSweeney is interested in that election. We'll be able to see where perhaps the future of voting goes.
Completely. That you're absolutely right on Ukraine. I mean, one thing that's in plain sight and what we've discussed is that Morgan McSweeney has embarked on the next stage of his career. And I think seeing him a bit on the international circuit, particularly that part of it that faces it into the challenges of Russia and Ukraine and the dangers to its democracy, that I think that's something that I'd expect to see him doing more work in that area. And he said exactly, what you had heard in your conversation a few weeks back, that there was Ukraine was a place that we could learn from, as well as thinking that we can support and take our knowledge too. And he said something really interesting, which I thought also had the ring of truth about it, that there was a tendency on the left, he said, in the UK and America, to be a bit Luddite about AI and think only in terms of how to constrain it or regulate it, rather than mastering it for the good of democracies. And I think this was plainly something that was going to be on his mind and others, that if your only approach to AI along the lines of this is coming at you like a train anyway, and your response to it is only how much do we dislike it, how much do we see the dangers for our democracy, but you don't master the tools of how you can also deploy it. It's a sword and a shield, if you like. I thought that was very intriguing, and that is certainly, I think, the way that people who were speaking on that panel and beyond, from Kyiv and also in the Balkans, from other places that feel that they are threatened by massive Russian disinformation and meddling in their elections, also made that point.
One of the sort of themes of Morgan McSweeney on that panel was, and he didn't spell it out too harshly, but just the sort of vibe is that there are bits of the British system that are a bit ungovernable. That is a theme that keeps coming up at the moment. And what do you make of that as a central charge for where we are? Because it's very pertinent as we consider changing prime ministers, whether or not it's going to make much difference.
Yeah, it's just a narrative I don't really think quite works. I think what we're saying, we're not inherently ungovernable. If you've lived in societies that are fractured to the point of being in civil war or conditions close to it, then then you've lived somewhere ungovernable. Indeed, if you look just sort of technically at the state, like Belgium, it's ungovernable. It's structurally, it doesn't work together. That's not true of the UK, Sam. We do have massive executive power. Why do we know that? Because we talk about lawmaking and driving through of laws and the problems that can arise along the way daily on this podcast and in our coverage. So we do have government structure, but we do also, I think, lack, and this is, I think, what you might be sort of tilting towards, is that our systems, both of delivery by government, the government machine as it's known, and political voting systems, can get into a situation where they're out of sync and where they can't form majorities. But there are solutions to that. I'm not particularly advocating for proportional representation, but if you look at a country that has a coalition system built into it, like Germany, they're just as, inverted commas, ungovernable as we are at the moment. They can't agree on what their reform package is in government. But the government will probably be more stable. You won't see a turnover of leaders that you see in the UK because they have an electoral system that kind of locks in a different kind of thinking. So ungovernable always sounds to me like a cry of despair. But what do you think? I mean, I think you tend a bit more in that direction than I do.
No, I'm an optimist. I think there have been big structural changes from the last time Labour was in power, but Labour really, when it was in opposition, should have paid more attention to them to be prepared. There's just big divisions inside the political parties, caused not least by the Brexit referendum, which licensed division within political parties, and those wounds never healed. I think another reason why politics is so much more difficult these days is because of social media, not just the sort of algorithms of public social media, but I think that literally WhatsApp has made life a lot more difficult for party systems, because closed groups of MPs can get incredibly het up about individual issues or sort of groups of concerns and end up coming quite violently back at the leader. It's something of a surprise to people like the whips. But all of that can be dealt with by sensitive, good leadership and, charismatic people at the top. And, I think that people paying sufficient attention to what's going on really does kind of deal with a lot of the problems in the political system. And I think there is a case for optimism for people that get it right. Maybe the sort of challenge just is one of not having leaders that have been quite there in the last few years on both sides of the aisle, who have challenges to deal with.
Well, can I ask you something that's also around this morning as a big topic then? Do you then think that something like limiting social media access for the under 16s, or even an outright ban, that's something, isn't it? Where, as you point out, you've got massive buy-in from different WhatsApp groups in different positions about what they want to happen on the back benches. In a slight sense, I think that the backbenchers are really seeing themselves as driving what they want to happen in policy, rather than waiting for the big government review and then responding to it. We've had Angela Rayner calling for an outright ban over the weekend. We're streeting piling in, urging ministers to treat social media like tobacco, where you would absolutely, most people would agree, you want to restrict access for the under 16s. West Streeting telling The Guardian it's extremely addictive, it's bad for our health. He used his former health secretary, elbow a bit on that one. Playbook also reporting this morning massively strong feeling among MPs who just don't want to shut up on this, and they feel if they push right now, they can sort of get the leadership to move in their direction. That's kind of difficult, isn't it? Because there are so many different ways in which you could go for regulation of social media. So you end up with, if you like, a lot of passion being poured through a very narrow funnel. And I wondered if you had that sort of same impression that I had on that one.
Absolutely. Look, I think this is a very good kind of example of exactly the problem. Look, if there is a change of Prime Minister, if Andy Burnham comes in, he'll face the same challenges, the same problems. He's actually locked himself into a lot of the same self-imposed constraints on things like fiscal rules and EU policy. But to be a success as a Prime Minister, he's got to get and keep his own Labour MPs on side. He's got to invert what you just described with the tail wagging the dog. He's got to be the leader taking the party to somewhere, rather than just lurching in response to the party. Because in the end, the Labour Party, like all parties, has a morass of views, and you'll never be able to keep all of it happy all of the time. So you've got to be leading from the front. And that, I think, not being in control of the Labour Party in Parliament, despite your huge majority, is kind of what went wrong for Keir Starmer, which feels like a good moment to maybe wrap things up, Anne?
I think so. It's such a wonderful morning. I think we should get out there.
We certainly should. Apologies to those who have been distracted by the birds, who have played a bigger role in this morning's podcast. Welcome, I hope, but prominent is what I'm told it sounds like down the microphone. So with birdsong in the air and birdsong in our heart, we say goodbye, and we will be back with you next Monday.
Oh, Sam, you're on your landed country estate in South London.
Lewisham's only. Lewisham's finest.